Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. All things Middle-earth here with a quick video looking at the best damage dealing commanders in Rise 4 2.0. 2.0 is all about pairing damage commanders with support that just allows them to deal more damage. We talked about support yesterday, as you can see on the screen right here. We have a support tier list. That is linked down below, so you can look at that or reference the video up in the top right. Also down in the description below really quickly is my top-up link through the top-up center. If you use that link to make any in-game purchases, it does support the channel. So if you are spending and trying to build up damage or support or whatever it is, if you want to use that link, it does support the channel, and it's no different from what you do in game. So be very, very appreciative if you use that. But let's go ahead and jump into the video. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. But before we start with number one, which is obviously going to be Dane. If you haven't played, Dane is an absolute beast. So he's number one. But before we get into the actual list, I just want to say, as you're going through this tier list and trying to figure out who you should run, I do think it's worth looking at your gear and seeing what you can actually support. Because if you pick 2 or 3 physical damage commanders, so for example, Dane, who is the best commander in the game, in my opinion, is a physical damage. Everything he has says physical damage. So you want to put attack gear on him that boosts his physical damage. If you want to run someone like, let's say, Sistaro, like I run, all of his skills say focus damage. If you run someone like Helm, do his poison. Those things are modified by the focus stat. So the gear you have might decide who you use a little bit. But again, if you have the best commanders, you should probably just use them. But it is worth noting that you should look at your gear to make sure you can at least support the commanders you're trying to put together. But anyway, starting off the list, and again, this should not be a surprise, Dane is an absolute beast. He has just the best stats in the game. He's got 3 damage skills, so that means you can take him all the way to Zenith 6 and max those 3 things out. I've seen Dane's doing well over 200k damage. It's crazy. Seriously, we're not going to kind of get long-winded about all these commanders because we could go all day. Dane is just the best commander in the game. It is what it is. So he's number 1. Now on to number 2. Number 2 is going to be Beorn. Beorn is also a physical damage dealer. He has 3 titles, so pretty self-explanatory. But just because they have 3 titles doesn't mean that they're automatically the best commanders in the game. They do have to have the stats to back that up, which Beorn and Dane do. And they are the only 2 damage commanders sitting in the Balrog tier of our tier list. So if you really want to know the best 2 damage commanders, it's those 2 guys, Beorn and Dane. But again, be aware of your gear because you do need 2 sets of physical damage gear to run them. And I think they're good enough that it's worth working on, but just keep that in mind. If you have a perfect set of focus gear, it might be worth considering someone who can actually run that. Next up, and one of my personal favorites, is the Shadow. The Shadow is a tier 2 or an epic commander, which is pretty nice because it's not as expensive to get him going, and he does some serious work. I've actually ascended mine to legendary, and again, he's got multiple damage skills, so it's great to use him, and I got physical gear on him. I will say, just a quick note on the Shadow, there is currently a bug that has to do with Swan Knights, and if there are more than 1 Swan Knight in the enemy formation, Shadow's skill, the Undertaker, does not work correctly because he's trying to attack 3 formations, but there's 2 Swan Knights that are trying to taunt, and it just kind of messes him up. So he really kind of breaks when you're going against Swan Knight. So if you're playing in Kings of Men consistently, you're planning to do that, I would maybe steer away from Shadow until that is fixed. But if you're not playing Kings of Men, or you just kind of want to roll the dice and try to avoid people with Swan Knights, he is a fantastic commander. Next up is going to be Lurtz, another epic commander, which again, if you're a little bit more on the budget-friendly side, running commanders like Lurtz and Shadow are going to be a little bit cheaper than Dane and Beorn. But Lurtz up next. He's got 2 damage skills, and honestly is seeing a really good time pretty much since season 1 of the game coming out with, Muma Lurtz running around. This has kind of been the best time for Lurtz. So if you're a Lurtz fan, now is the time. He's a fantastic damage commander. Next up is Sistaro, and he is our first elemental damage commander on the list. Again, don't get hung up too much. We're in the A tier now, starting with Shadow. Don't get hung up too much on where they're at in the order, and more just that they're A tier commanders. So you could argue that Sistaro was lower or higher, but again, I think they're all very competitive. But we have Sistaro here, who does have 3 focus damage skills. So again, you want focus gear with him. I've been very happy with him. I've got his relic. I've kind of gone all in on him, and I'm not disappointed. Is he the best? Is he Dane? No. Is he still very competitive? I think so. So I've enjoyed him. And again, he's much better, I think, in 2.0 than he was in 1.0. Not that he wasn't good, but I think he's seeing a better time in 2.0. So Sistaro is a great one as well. Next up is Sarman, and Sarman, in my opinion, is also seeing better use in 2.0 than he was in 1.0. You're just going to run Of Many Colors in Voice of Sarman for his damage build, and he's going to put out some pretty decent damage. Next up is Dane's son. He's not really Dane's son, but he is kind of a mini Dane because he has a lot of similar skills, but just not quite as beefy as Dane. It's Gimli. Gimli is still fantastic. He's got 3 damage abilities. Again, not a lot to say here. He's a good one. Physical damage, probably worth ascending if you're looking at epic to ascend to legendary. but Gimli is a surefire investment. Next up is going to be Skullhelm. Now, Skullhelm, I think, has one of the biggest turnarounds from 1.0, just not super usable 1.0 at all. And again, very, very good. Has multiple. Actually, her entire kit technically has elemental damage skills. So if you had a very, very high respect Skull Helm for whatever reason, you could really put some interesting stuff together depending on what troops you're using. You just put out a lot of poison damage, a lot of focus damage. So Skull Helm is a very interesting one. Her relic goes along with her whole kit too. So not a bad one to try if you want to try out some Nazgul. Now, speaking of Nazgul, the Undying is another great Nazgul, but I will say, just like the Shadow, he does suffer from the same Undertaker bug that's happening right now with Swan Knight. So if there are multiple enemy Swan Knights, the Undertaker ability just does not work correctly. He kind of bugs out and will do less damage. But the nice thing about the Undying here is that he has 2 damage skills and a good support skill. So you could use him as a hybrid support damage. You could use him as full damage. There's some options. I wouldn't touch the heal personally, but again, besides that, he's got a very good kit and he will put out some very decent damage. Next up is King Aragorn. King Aragorn has 2 damage skills, and other than that, there's not a whole lot going on. His R5 is decent if you have extra points, but it is dependent on whether or not you hit Stun or Madness, so I don't like it as much. But for the most part, just being a legendary, having good stats, he will put out some very decent damage with his 2 damage abilities. Now, next up is Tier 2 Aragorn, who is my personal favorite commander in the game. I don't know why, I just always wanted to use him. He is also good. He has the same skills here that King Aragorn does. Obviously, his stats are lower because he's a Tier 2 commander, so you have to keep that in mind. However, I do like both of his sub skills a lot more. His Hidden Air is going to increase attack for men, which is fine, but the level 5 ability here is damage dealt to melee units plus 10%. So obviously depends on who you're fighting, but the fact that that does kind of help with his actual kit is pretty nice. This is an increase of defense, which also unit defense isn't that bad either. So Tier 2 Aragorn, again, maybe not the best, but I think he's still very solid, and I'll definitely be running him in the future, so stay tuned. Now, last but not least in our A tier is going to be Bard. Now, the only reason Bard's not ranked higher, because he definitely could be, is because I've not seen enough of him to really be convinced of his actual placement if he's in the Balrog tier or top of A tier or whatever it is. I think he's very, very interesting, though. He does physical damage, and he has anti-commander damage stuff, which is very much part of the meta right now, so it makes sense that he would have a place in that. But where exactly it is, we're not 100% sure, at least I'm not. I haven't seen a ton of reports of very high respect, high geared, high level Bard. So for the most part, we're going to wait until we kind of really put him in an actual spot. But he's going to close at the A tier because he's got 3 damage skills. He's a legendary, anti-commander stuff. He's got bleed. I mean, he has all the stuff. We just need to see more of them running around so we can see how well he actually does consistently. But Bard is going to close out the A tier. All right, now rapid fire so we can finish this out without this video being too long. The next one up is going to be Galadriel, just running her R1 tree. One thing I like about her is you don't need high respect on her to run this. If you just have her at below respect 3, you can still run her focus damage build, which I think is pretty decent. So Galadriel is the next one up. Next up is going to be Éomer. Éomer is actually a very decent damage commander just on his own, but he usually plugs into the mounted commander lineup with Theoden, Denethor, and Imrahil for that kind of healing mounted combo that we see a lot of, or the medium unit, I should say. But he can be a damage commander on his own. Whether you use him with that lineup with mostly damage or you run him with that, he can definitely get some stuff done. Now, our first but not last tier 1 commander on the list is going to be Agzok. Agzok has technically all damage skills in his kit, but he's a tier 1. So to actually utilize a lot of it, you need to put a lot of money into him. And it takes so long to upgrade these commanders beyond, mighty to epic to legendary, because you can only ever use their level 1 item, which they lose value as you ascend them. So if I ascend him, he only gets 12 points for it instead of 40, which means as you go to epic and then legendary, it's just going to take forever to get him upgraded. So I haven't seen a lot out there, but he does have technically a full kit of damage abilities. So I think he's someone that if you were just starting the game and you wanted to really invest long term, he could definitely get some work done more than a lot of other tier 1s. So Agzok's an interesting one, but until they change how the ascension system works in leveling up commanders through different tiers, it's going to be hard to get him at a level to compete with those that are tier 3 commanders in our A or Balrog tier. And speaking of tier 1s, Hirgon is no longer just here for siege. He doesn't actually have siege at all anymore. He does have 2 physical damage skills though, his Herald and his Devotion. And then Warden is an evade skill, which is not bad either. So depending on how high you have him, you could run a somewhat, support damage build. You could also just go with the full damage build. But Hirgon is an interesting one. Again, if you're starting out brand new, you're not going to have all the tier 2s and 3s right away. So he's probably one of the best tier 1s, maybe tied for tier 1 good side. So definitely want to consider if you want to build a good formation and you're new to the game. Now, next up is Thoren Oakenshield. Thoren is a tier 3. He has multiple damage abilities. People didn't seem too interested in running him. I think partially because of his just stats not being the best. His damage has range on it, so it's not always as good because he could do a lot more or a lot less. But overall, he does have several physical damage abilities. So if you have a Thoren, he definitely can get some work done. I don't think he's quite as good as the other tier 3s that we've seen so far, but also as time goes on, we might find builds that he fits more into. So Thoren is still a very, very good damage commander. Now, definitely not what he used to be, but Dwalin is still an okay damage commander. He has Experienced Warrior and Endurance Blood, which is the best damage skill in the game from my understanding. So he can run those two skills, but previously, you know, he had an R5 that was much better and worked against burn damage, which was very prevalent. Now it's not. So he's just kind of that budget commander, damage commander option that you could run. Again, if you're new, I'd be running Dwalin and Hirgon on the good side. Evil side is a little bit less options, or just Agzok, but not what he used to be. But Dwalin is still a solid commander, and if you have proper support with him, he can still do a lot of damage himself. Next up is Balin, and not because he's Retaliate anymore, because they took that away, but he does have 2 damage skills. So again, we're kind of to the bottom of the barrel. We're just looking for commanders who have okay stats and 2 damage skills. And Balin does run Endurance Blood, which all the dwarves run, but that paired with Revivalist makes him a decent stand-in as well. If you had one previously, you could definitely use him as your kind of final in your damage lineup. And last but not least, technically least on this list, but again, we're not going to argue about rankings because you could say he's higher or lower, but it's Legless. Legless has 2 damage abilities. I will also say Legless's relic, as well as like Lurtz's, both got a lot better in my opinion. It's just now normal attacks inflict additional physical damage. So if you do happen to get this and refine it and start, it's pretty significant. So I do think there could be some pretty good Leglesses out there. And again, he's got 2 damage skills. So if you want to run Legless, he's very solid as well. But that will do it for our damage commanders tier list, or just top, whatever you want to call this thing. Here you can see, again, I'll have this image linked down below again with the overall tier list. I'll have the support tier list down there as well as this one. And again, that top-up link, if you are spending and you want to use that, it does support the channel. But let me know what you guys think. Did I miss anybody? Again, I don't usually try and spend too much time trying to decide where they rank. You could argue that Legless is better than Balin, for example. But if they're in the A tier, they're in the A tier in my mind. So if you do think anyone's misranked in terms of, you know, belonging in the Balrog tier or A and B or B and A, whatever it is, let me know down below. Or if there's someone down here who maybe should just be included that isn't, let me know. I'd love to hear from you guys. But that'll do it for this one. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video.